So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So this is the start of the biblical Genesis from the Old Testament. Tradition creates Moses as the author of Genesis, but modern scholars increasingly see it as a product of numerous authors during the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Well, I'm not a scholar on the Bible, and I thought it was important to start with this historical introduction as a lead into my talk and ask the question, what is the Spiritist perspective on Genesis? So let's fast forward to the 1850s and to the amazing work of Hippolyte Denisard Léon Rievael, better known by his pen name Allan Kardec. I think it's important to appreciate the character of Monsieur Rievael to understand why the high order spirits chose him to codify and disseminate Spiritism. For me, the three major attributes of his character were: one, his passion for education, after he studied with Pestalozzi in Switzerland; secondly, his extensive knowledge of the spirits of science and medicine; and third, and perhaps more important of all, his rational and logical way of thinking. I can only imagine the anxiety of the benevolent spirits when the time finally arrived, 1800 years after the passing of Jesus, to initiate the process of promulgating the Spiritist doctrine. Now, even though Rievael was chosen not only because of his current stellar credentials, but presumably also due to his remarkable track record from the prior reincarnations, it's probable also that he chose this task as a mission before he reincarnated. But however, due to the vagaries of incarnate life and free will, would he be up to the task? Would his rational and logical way of thinking be an asset or an obstacle? Would he accept the message of the invisible intelligences, or dismiss out of hand? So let's move on to the birth of contemporary spiritualist movement. And it can be traced back to Hydesville in New York in 1848 with the three Fox sisters, who started to hear spirit manifestations and learned how to communicate with them. The movement spread across America, reached Europe in the 1850s, particularly in Paris, where seance parties became all the rage. This was the day, obviously, before television and notebooks and so on, but seance parties were part of the culture at the time. So Rievael was persuaded by close colleagues to witness these spirit communications, and though extremely skeptical at first, after attending a few meetings, he became convinced that an unknown intelligence was behind the communications. In the first English version of the Spirits book, the translator, Anna Blackwell, wrote, "A friend of Rievael had two daughters who had become what are now called mediums. They were carefree, lively, amiable girls who were fond of socializing, dancing, and amusement. When sitting by themselves or with their young companions, they habitually received communications in harmony with their worldly and somewhat frivolous dispositions. However, to their surprise, the surprise of all concerned, it was discovered that whenever Rievael was present, the messages transmitted through these young ladies acquired a very grave and serious character. When he asked the invisible intelligences what caused this change, he was told that, quote, "Spirits of a much higher order than those who habitually communicate through these two young mediums have come expressly for you and will continue to do so in order for you to fulfill an important mission." So as we all know, he did complete that mission, and finally in 1857 the Spirit book was launched. The first edition was only 1,200 copies, and it sold out within a few days. And actually, Kardec financed that first edition. And the Spirit book is made up of, as we know, 1,019 questions and answered, divided into 4 parts. The first part is part 1, first causes. And Kardec starts by asking in question 1, what is God? To which the Spirit answers, God is the supreme intelligence, the first cause of all things. Kardec continues to pursue this line of questioning about God, and in answer to question 13, the spirits finally say, look, nevertheless, you should understand there are things that transcend the intelligence of the most intelligent person, things that your language cannot define because it's limited by your ideas and sensations. And then he goes on in that first part to introduce the general elements of the universe, spirit, matter, space, creation, and vital principle. In part 2, Kardec introduced the concept of the spirit world, which surrounds us all. To those new to Spiritism, as I was 6-7 years ago, this is probably the most difficult part of Spiritism to grasp. For me, with my scientific way of thinking, it was a major challenge and paradigm shift to accept the possibility that exists a non-material world inaccessible to our 5 senses. So, part 3, he introduced the religious side of Spiritism by explaining the divine laws, the 12 divine laws, and how they guide us in our moral development. And finally, in the last part of the Spirit books, he explains the philosophical aspect of Spiritism, why we have joys and sorrows in earthly life, why we're here, where are we going, what happens after death of the physical body, and how our future spiritual existence is molded by the choices we make in this life. So, 4 years later, Kardec publishes the Medium's book, which expands on the second part of the Spirit's book, where we learn about the spirit world. And in the summary on the back cover, the book states, this book combines teachings of the spirits concerned with the theory behind all kinds of manifestations, the means of communicating with the invisible world, and the development of mediumship, the difficulties that might be encountered in the practice of Spiritism. So, the first 2 books really are the basic philosophical foundations of Spiritism, and of course some religious aspects. And these are the real foundations of the Spiritist doctrine. So in the third book, The Gospel According to Spiritism, Kardec expands on the second part of the Spirit's book and analyzes the teachings of Jesus in the light of Spiritism. And each chapter follows a similar format of excerpts from the New Testament, either parables or the Beatitudes, then comments by Kardec, and then messages from the high order spirits. So you can see there's a different contextual aspect of the gospel, whereas the Spirit's book and the Medium's book are really users' manuals, technical manuals, going through the philosophy and the basic foundations. The gospel really is a user's manual. It teaches us how we can apply the religious teachings in chapter 3 of the Spirit's book to our daily lives. So, similarly with the book 4, Heaven and Hell, Kardec expands on the last part of the Spirit book, explaining that heaven and hell are not physical places, only states of mind that are created by our actions and our previous incarnate existence through the laws of cause and effects. So, like the Gospel, heaven and hell, again, is a user's manual. It takes us from the last part of the Spirit's book, and again, from the knowledge and the testimonials of over 70 spirits that are covered in the book, they help us learn from the past spirits what their actions in their lives have done and what it leads to. And he groups all these, I think there's 70 testimonials in heaven and hell, and he groups them together, such as happy spirits, average spirits, suffering spirits, repentant criminals, hardened spirits, those who committed suicide, and finally expiating spirits. So again, a really good, solid base for us to learn from experiences and help us in our daily lives and prepare for a better life to come. Just at this point, I just want to acknowledge a lot of the learning I had from preparing for this talk, and that was from Giulio Padovan. He's a PhD scientist, teaches at the University of New York. It's been a spiritist since he was 15, and he's done a series of videos on the Gospel, on Genesis, including some interviews. So I've got a lot of information from him, and I recommend, if you want to pursue more, look at the videos of Giulio Padovan. So having written these 4 books, why did Kardec, or better, the Spirit Mentors, decide to compile a 5th book? Why not another pair of books? So from this overview of the first 4 books, I believe there's 2 things missing. And the first one, it really is quite obvious. There is little or nothing mention of God in all those 4 books. Okay, there is the first 13 questions of the Spirit's book, which relate to the attributes of God. And so, again, nothing much on God. The second thing that I think is missing also is we all know that Spiritism is formed on 3 pinnacles, philosophy, religion, and science. And there's very little science in those first 4 books. So in the Gospel, he brings these together and fills those gaps. So basically, I think that Genesis is a book about God, the Creator, and about science, and the way science affects and helps develop the whole Spiritist doctrine. So, let's get into Genesis. And the full title is Genesis, Miracles and Predictions According to Spiritism. Before we open the book, I'd like to ask, how many here have actually read the whole book of Genesis? 1, 2, 3. Not so many. Any more have read but never finished? A few more, right. Not so many. Yeah, it is a difficult book. It's complex. But I think there's 2 myths we need to refute right away. Genesis is a book about science. It's not a book about science. Again, I have pointed out that science was the root of the whole codification, the methodology that Kardec applied, but it's not a book about science. If you want to learn about science, you search for a textbook or a current periodical to find the most up-to-date teachings. Also, Genesis is often criticized for being scientifically out of date. Now, it's true, it's written over 150 years ago, and at that time, understanding of electricity and magnetism was very rudimentary. Subatomic particles hadn't even been discovered. So the scientific parts of Genesis should be read considering the scientific knowledge at that time. But what is more important is how science has shaped and continues to shape the Spiritist understanding. The second myth to dismiss really is that Genesis is a complicated book. It is complex, don't get me wrong, okay? But it can be read bit by bit. You can pull out a chapter of Genesis and read it, and it's very clear. I think it's very clear. I compare it to learning to play chess. The object of the game, checkmate, is simple. Individual moves of the pieces are easy to learn. But like becoming a skillful chess player, the challenge is to understanding Genesis, to step back and piece all the pieces together, put all the pieces together, and see the entirety of Kardec's rational and logical arguments and how they relate to all the others. So let's get rid of those 2 myths. The other thing is the book is over 550 pages. Obviously, it's a challenge to summarize it in 40 minutes. So I'm going to narrow the subject matter down, and I'm just going to focus on Genesis, the first part. The miracles and predictions according to Spiritism, I'm going to try and leave for future talks. Maybe we can schedule them before the end of the year. So let's talk about Genesis. And in Genesis, there are 12 chapters. What I've done is grouped into 3 blocks, if you like. The first block, the character, the Spirit revelation, God and the good and evil. And that really is an expansion on the first part of the Spirit's book, which he never really talks about in all the other 3 books that followed. So here he comes back and addresses those. The second section is really the science of it. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, because this, although it makes very good reading, it was based on the science of 150 years ago. And we have advanced incredibly since that time. And I'll come back to that point afterwards. But the third and most important part of the book is these 2 chapters, particularly the spiritual Genesis. And that's the key message I'm going to try and get at today and hope that you'll take home with you. So, let's go into the character of Spiritist revelation. And Kardec starts Genesis by asking the question, can Spiritism be considered a revelation? Excuse me 1 second here. And continues by questioning its authenticity, whether it came from God, is it absolute or susceptible to modification, what is the usefulness of the moral teaching, if there are none other than those of Christ. In other words, he challenges his own work. And this is typical of the way a scientist approaches a challenge, a problem, first by reviewing all the data, maybe putting together a hypothesis, and then spends all the time trying to disprove that, trying to the maximum to prove that the hypothesis is wrong. And if eventually they can't prove it's wrong, must be right. And this is what Kardec does in all his work. He always goes to look at the other point of view and challenge it. Today, in today's modern world, we tend to come to an opinion and then go to fake news to support it. That's not right. The way is we go to the data, the evidence. So he starts off by asking the question, can Spiritism be considered revelation? And he continues by question, oh sorry, I've done that. He then defines the meaning of revelation, to reveal, which comes from the Latin revelare, which the root is veil, literally means to come out from under the veil, or figuratively, to discover, to make something known that has been previously secret or unknown. From this perspective, all the sciences that enable us to know the mystery of nature are revelations. One could say that there is for humankind an ongoing revelation. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Einstein were all revelators. These geniuses and many more have periodically graced humankind with their revelations, thus giving a boost to knowledge and scientific evolvement for the society as a whole. Just on that point, if you have had the opportunity to read On the Way to the Light, Emmanuel, who was psychographed by Chico Xavier, chronicles a whole series of incredible individuals that have graced our planet and given their knowledge. Amazing book. Because these great figures from science have made their own discoveries and they're classified as first-order revelators. Those who learn directly from them and pass on to other students were second-order revelators, and so on. The essential characteristic of a revelation, it must be the truth. However, it must be also recognized that the truth is always based on current knowledge and understanding of the time, and as much it's got to be considered as a relative truth and never an absolute truth. There is very rarely an absolute truth in life. It's always relevant to the information we have at hand at that time. For centuries, the Earth was considered flat. In the 16th century, it was formally accepted that the Earth revolved around the Sun, rather than vice versa. With the discovery of the telescope, New World and scientific theories were born. The microscope opened the field of histology to the study of living cells within plants and animals. So both these tools, the telescope, the microscope, expanded our human sight into the macro and the micro worlds respectively. And there's a great parallel here. With Spiritist doctrine, we've founded the tool. And what is that tool? The tool is mediumship. So there's an incredible comparison there. And mediumship expands our senses into the spiritual world. In the special case of religious faith, revelation applies more particularly to spiritual matters, which humans cannot know by themselves and which they cannot discover by means of their senses, the understanding of which was given to them by God or God's messengers. Considered from this point of view, religious revelation implies complete passivity, and this we see from a lot of the old religious doctrine. You just buy it and use it, but you don't question it. Accepted without question, without examination, without argument. The Spiritist revelation, on the other hand, has a dual character. It derives simultaneously from the divine revelation, but also a scientific one. In the former, the fundamental points of the doctrine come from the teaching given by spirits, appointed by God to enlighten human beings of matters in which they were ignorant and could not learn by themselves, but which they must now know, now that they're mature enough to understand them. So again, we've reached the stage of our evolution where our maturity, our intellectual maturity and our moral maturity enables us to understand more of these principles which we couldn't understand, say, at the time of Jesus. And for the latter, now we're talking about scientific revelations, such teachings are not the privilege of any one individual, but were given to the whole world through the same means. That those who transmit them and receive them are not passive subjects, excused from the work of observation and research. They are not called upon to renounce their own reason and free will. That scrutinizing them is not prohibited, but on the contrary, recommended. And finally, the doctrine has not been dictated in its entirety, nor imposed upon blind faith, but rather it is deduced from human endeavour. And those were Kardec's words, very important. So, in chapter 2, we talk about God. And he starts up by saying, this is an elementary principle that a cause is judged by its effects, even though the cause may not be seen. And he goes on, Looking around oneself at the works of nature, observing the foresight and wisdom and the harmony that presides over all things, one realizes there is not one of them that does not surpass even the highest reach of the human mind. And the biggest proof of God is what we see around us, the beauty of nature, the beauty of this planet that we live on. However, similar to the answer to question 13 of the Spirit's book, which I cited earlier, Kardec addresses the divine nature, and he explains, it is not given to human beings to probe the inner nature of God. They lack that sense that can be acquired only through complete purification of the spirit. However, if they cannot grasp the essence of God, they can by reasoning arrive at God's necessary attributes. So I just want to take a little aside here, and I'm sure everyone here has their own construct of God. We're all spiritists, but I'm certain that each and every one of us has a unique conception of how we relate to God. And when I look back at my life before Spiritism, before Spiritism, I really had difficulty in aligning myself with the concept of God. I was probably agnostic. Much as I looked and much as I tried to find the truth, I couldn't find it. But today, after 6-7 years studying Spiritism, I really feel at home. I think also what comforts me is these words here that, the Spirits tell us at our level of involvement, understanding what is God is not easy. We can only really get close to God when we reach that purified spirit level. So the way I've come to reconcile my belief in God is I imagine that we're all living in this amazing planet Earth, and we're all companions, we're all associates in this huge company which I call Supreme Intelligence, okay? There's probably 70 million of us. 23 million of us, 7 of them incarnate, the rest discarnate. But when I look up and see what's the head of Supreme Intelligence Inc., should we call it, I don't see a CEO, I see a GOD, which is the Grand Organizing Designer. And he's at the top, okay? It's at the top. And below that we have the purified spirits, then we have the governors of the various regions of the world. We are fortunate to have Jesus, who's the governor of planet Earth and its surrounding planets. And then so on down through the elevated spirits, the benevolent spirits, my guardian angel, who hopefully is with me here today. And then all of us down here at the bottom level, okay, we're all pretty ignorant spirits, we're still learning. But how do we associate it with that figure right at the top? And like any good organization, we have a mission statement. And our mission statement is very simple, 4 words: to promote unconditional love. And that's the message. That's the message. That's where God is. Okay? And there's guidelines, there's tools, how we can enhance our virtues. Okay? And also there's other manuals and tools on how we can eliminate or reduce our vices of jealousy and pride and so on. But that's the way I see God. And afterwards I hope that some of you will share what your vision of God is. I know we were talking to Sandra the other day, and she'd been on a meditation retreat and lots of good ideas, and I'm sure her concept of God, construct of God, is different. And everyone here has something different. But at the end of the day, I think we all come back to unconditional love. That is the real message. Okay, so these are all the attributes of God which the Spirit's book and Genesis tell us about. Finally, in chapter 3, it's called Good and Evil. It makes fascinating reading. It's building upon the moral laws from the Spirit's book, but also parts of heaven and hell. And Kardec discusses the concept of eternal punishment. Like many chapters of Genesis, it can be read in isolation, and it will still be a very valuable lesson in understanding the Spiritist doctrine. Okay, so this is the 5 chapters that are really associated with science. And chapter 4, he talks about the role of science in Genesis. He opens the chapter by stating that the history of the origin of nearly all ancient peoples is mingled with their religion and their writings, including explanation regarding the formation and arrangement of the universe. That it is relative to the state of their knowledge at the time. He goes on to say that therefore the sacred writings were simultaneously the first writing on science, just as much as they were for a long, long time the sole code of civil law, and that we understand from the whole Jewish, documents and so on. He continues in item 3 to say the riddles of creation are only explained when astronomy, was able to probe the depths of the heavens, when calculus could determine the movement, position, volume, nature, and role of the heavenly bodies. That physics revealed the law of gravity, heat, light, electricity. That chemistry taught us about the transformation of matter and mineralogy, the materials that make up the globe's crust. Geology taught us to read geological strata in the globe's gradual formation. And it behoved botany, zoology, paleontology, anthropology to initiate humankind into the filiation and succession of organic structured beings. And finally, and I love this phrase, with archaeology, we could follow the footprint of humankind across the ages. In other words, by complementing each other, all these scientists were able to bring their indispensable contingent to the understanding of history of the world. In chapter 5, he talks about ancient and modern world theories, starting off with the Greek philosophers Pythagoras and Ptolemy, Copernicus, Galileo, right through to the modern being of the 1850s, thinkers of Kepler, Newton, and Laplace. A little bit about chapter 6, general uranography. Uranography is not a word that's used much these days. It's basically astronomy or the mapping of the heavens. But it's interesting that this chapter is actually based on a communication with the group, the Spiritist Parisian Society. You must remember also that Kardec wrote these 5 books and a couple of others, but during the 12 years he was meeting every week with the group of the Spiritists in Paris. And they actually published an annual book on all those readings and communications. And the volume of narrative in those 12 books are like 10 times more than the 5 books of the Spiritist codification. There's a huge amount of information there. But going back to chapter 6, it was actually, the medium was, let me just get his name right here, Camille Flammarion. And he was a well-known astronomer, but also a very good medium. And he spent 2 years communicating messages from Galileo. And again, it's amazing to see that connection. But today we know the origin of the universe, the galaxies, the stars, the planets, like our own planet Earth, have been explained by the theory of the Big Bang, originally proposed in about the 20th century, and further refined, and it's still correct today. It's still a theory. Okay, it's still a relative truth based on current observations and measurements. But it's the prevailing cosmological model for the history of the universe, tracing back to its inception from a single point 13.8 billion years ago. Rather difficult to get our heads around that. If we think Spiritism is difficult to get our heads around, trying to understand what happens at the start of the universe is even more difficult. But the Big Bang explains how subatomic particles came together. They were initially just helium, hydrogen, lithium. These went out into nebulae, and then they coalesced, and the action of gravity they eventually exploded again, and we got the heavier elements such as carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, calcium, and potassium. And these are all particles that are in our bodies now. We are all part of that Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Our own solar system was formed in that representation. What has been discovered in the last 30 years is that the rate of expansion is accelerating. It shouldn't be. Gravity should be pulling things together, and the rate of expansion should be slowing down. But we now know from Kepler telescope, Hubble, and many other telescopes that have gone beyond our planet now, so we can see even further, that the universe is expanding. And there's a lot of unknowns that brings, like dark matter and dark energy, but I won't go there. That's another long subject. So, where was I? So this is a pictorial representation of Earth. Planet Earth is what, 4.6 billion years old, much younger than the universe. And this, if you start at the top at 12 o'clock and go around clockwise, these are all the different phases of when first life formed about 3.5 billion years ago, to the simple cells and then the more complex cells. And eventually we got to the animals and the plants and the dinosaurs. And that little sphere at the top is us, the human race. And the human race, we've only been here about 100 years, which is nothing compared to the 4.4 billion they've gone before that, or the 13.8 since the start of time. But the Big Bang and this representation of the timeline of planet Earth does not by any means contradict the words of Kardec. It simply updates and complements his findings, reasoning, based on modern science of observation. So, let's move on to organic Genesis. When I read Genesis last year for the second time, I got really enthralled by these two chapters, Organic Genesis and the successive one is Spiritual Genesis. So much so that I actually gave a talk in December where I just focused on these two chapters. So today I'm not going to go through the details, I'm looking at the main concept. If you're interested, go to YouTube and learn a bit more, and there's more. But this is the real crux of what Genesis is all about. Also, apart from the Big Bang theory complemented Kardec's account of the formation of the universe, Darwin also expanded on Kardec's theory of the origin of evolution of organic life on Earth. What I find surprising is that while Kardec, let me just move on here, there we go. Darwin's book on the origin of species was actually published about 8 years before Kardec, and yet in the whole of the writing and codification of Kardec, there's no mention of Darwin. And to me, that's an enigma. I don't know the answer to that. I'm trying to find out the answer to that. Why did he not? And I'm sure that Kardec was totally aware of everything that was going on in the world of science. So why didn't he reference to it? There's no contradiction. The two, really fit. But anyway, that being said, that's another subject. At the end of Organic Genesis, Kardec has actually, I think, one of the most amazing statements here, and it goes like this. Spiritism walks hand in hand with materialism on the terrain of matter. It accepts everything that materialism accepts, but at the point where materialism stops, Spiritism goes further. Spiritism and materialism are like two travelers who journey together from the same starting point, continue their way, and discover a whole new world. Having gone a certain distance, one says, I can't go any farther, while the other continues his way and discovers a whole new world. So, having come to this point with Genesis, materialism stops, whereas Spiritism carries on with its research in the realm of spiritual Genesis. So we come to spiritual Genesis, and again, I'm not going to go into details, but I would like to end by emphasizing the following. How else can we explain the exponential rise of moral and intellectual evolvement since the time of the agricultural revolution, maybe 15,000 years ago, the industrial revolution 200 years ago, to the digital revolution the last 25 years? How else can we explain the incredible engineering feats of the pyramids and the architectural similarities of the constructions of the Egyptians with those of simultaneously built primitive civilizations on distant corners of the planet? You look at some of the architecture and the structure of the pyramids and the remains on Easter Island and various other points on the globe. They're all at the same time. How did we have that knowledge? It can only be really understood through the idea that the spirit is reincarnating. And almost certainly some of those spirits, because we went from probably 10,000 human Homo sapiens 70,000 years ago to 7 billion now, they come from other places, other more advanced worlds, and they brought with them their knowledge. And how else can we explain the incredible talents of children who are born with the ability to play Beethoven sonatas at 4 years old, or gain a medical doctorate at 17? How else can we explain our world today is full of child prodigies, excelling in wide-ranging abilities from science, technology, engineering, visual and performing arts, mathematics, and social sciences? How else can we explain how identical twins, born with exactly the same DNA, raised by the same loving parents, can grow up with such wildly divergent abilities and personalities? Only when we consider the spiritual genesis as first conceived and explained by Kardec and the benevolent spirits some 150 years ago can we really appreciate and understand the complexities and challenges of the world we live in. But more importantly, the opportunities that lie before us. So I'd like to end my talk by returning to my opening comments on biblical Genesis and read to you the final comment at the end of Kardec's chapter 12 on the Mosaic. Thanks to this light, men and women from henceforth know where they have come from, where they are going, why they are on earth, and why they suffer. They know that the future is in their hands, and that the duration of their captivity on this world depends on them. Rid of restrictive and trivial, Genesis appears grand and worthy of the majesty, the goodness and the justice of the Creator. Considered from this point of view, it will confound disbelief and triumph over it. So I thank you for your attention.